Good morning. It's Monday, March 31st. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 542 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer, coming to you live from Tel Aviv in Israel. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, I had kind of a wild day yesterday. After a quiet weekend in Jerusalem, I hopped in a cab to make my way here to Tel Aviv for meetings. Along the way, I got an alert on my phone that the Houthis in Yemen had popped off another ballistic missile toward Israel. So I knew I would soon hear a siren, and sure enough, the sirens began to shriek on the highway. So my cab driver did what he was supposed to do. He pulled over to the side of the road where dozens of other cars had stopped, and Israelis were on the ground bracing for impact. As my driver pulled over, we felt a hard thud. Of course, my immediate thought was that we had been hit by shrapnel. But as it turns out, it was a motorcyclist who had apparently didn't realize what was going on. To my horror, he went flying off of his bike. The emergency medical technicians who rushed to the scene informed me that the man would be fine, but it was a scary moment. And it's a reminder to all of us that even when missiles are intercepted, as was the case yesterday, it doesn't mean that all is fine in Israel. People get hurt in the chaos, and that's why they call it terrorism. Our guest today is Michael Rubin. He's a repeat offender on this program now. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the director of policy analysis at the Middle East Forum, where I used to work. Michael recently contributed to an FDD memo co-written with yours truly, as well as FDD's resident Turkey guy, Sinan Cidi, and our talented network tracking colleague, Melissa Sachs. Our memo explores the deep and disturbing ties between Hamas and the regime in Turkey. Turkey is in the news right now, not for Hamas, or not entirely, but for those massive protests that may pose a serious challenge to the rule of strongman Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Michael and I will talk about all this and more, so hang tight for that. So let's talk about those protests in Turkey. They're massive and they're enduring, having passed the 10-day mark over the weekend. Turks have had enough of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's authoritarian rule. He's been in power since 2003. He's got a stranglehold on the media, the judiciary, the military, and more. He's pilfered untold millions from the state. In short, he's the Turkish version of Vladimir Putin. At the center of these protests is Turkey's opposition party, the Republic People's Party, or CHP. The leader of that party, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was jailed by Erdogan's thugs on spurious charges, and his wife has now become an inspiration to the crowds. İmamoğlu wrote a letter that was read to protesters over the weekend. His message was one of courage. The nation is united, and try as he might, Erdogan doesn't stand a chance against the Turkish people. But İmamoğlu is not the only star attraction. There's also that bizarre footage of a protester dressed in a bright yellow Pikachu costume running from Turkish security forces. Can't make this stuff up. Millions of Turks and apparently Pokemon characters are demanding that Erdogan resign. How did Erdogan respond? Oh, you know where this is going. The Hamas-supporting strongman called for war with Israel. We talk a lot here at FDD about bringing down the terror-supporting regime in Tehran, but I wouldn't mind watching Erdogan get kicked to the curb by his own people. Like dominoes, that could inspire Iranians to intensify their own protests and bring down their own regime, too. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Erdogan's Hamas clients are also dealing with popular unrest. Over the weekend, Hamas terrorists kidnapped, tortured, and killed a Palestinian man who participated in last week's anti-Hamas protests. The 22-year-old body was dumped in front of his family's home. During his funeral procession, dozens of Palestinians were filmed shouting for Hamas to quit the Gaza Strip. This was reportedly the first execution in connection to last week's protests. But this kind of thuggery is certainly not new. Hamas has consistently threatened Palestinian activists. The terrorist group is a death cult with zero regard for the Palestinian people, despite saying that it acts on behalf of the Palestinian cause. Yesterday, a protest leader from Gaza published an article in the Washington Post telling the world that Hamas is killing, not liberating the Palestinian people. If Palestinians in Gaza are to have a future, Hamas needs to go. Headline 2, the regime in Iran replied to President Trump's letter to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In case you missed it, a couple of weeks ago, Trump sent a letter to Khamenei encouraging him to greenlight a new round of nuclear talks. Apparently, that's not something the Islamic Republic is willing to do, at least not directly. Tehran rejected the possibility of direct talks with the U.S., but left the door open for indirect negotiations. In televised remarks, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian accused Washington of breaching its promises to the terrorist-supporting regime, and he said that the United States needs to prove that it's trustworthy before Tehran will consider talks. That's pretty rich coming from the president of a country that's lied to the world for years about its nuclear program. Shortly before Pezeshkian's remarks, Trump told NBC News that Iran should expect some unprecedented bombing if it doesn't make a deal. Headline 3, the United States military continues to hammer the Houthis. That's the good news. More Houthi targets are getting degraded and destroyed. But the bad news is that the group still has the ability to launch ballistic missiles in Israel. And this is something new. No terrorist organization in the world has ever done this, and they've never done it consistently, for that matter. As I noted at the top of the show, the missile on Sunday caused sirens to blare across the center of the country. Israeli air defenses intercepted the missile before it crossed into Israel. In addition to the accident on the highway, an Israeli woman was injured after falling some 15 feet into a ditch while running for shelter. This was the Houthis' 8th attack, at least, on Israel since the IDF resumed its offensive in Gaza. I've recently become interested in the STC. That's shorthand for the Southern Transitional Council. They're the Yemeni opposition group that wants to bring down the Houthis. They're based in the south of the country, and they desperately need American support. I'm hoping to bring somebody from the SDC on this program in the coming days, so stay tuned for that. All right, it's time for my interview now with Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute and the Middle East Forum. We're going to talk Turkey and what these protests mean for the future of NATO's only Islamist dictatorship. Welcome to the program, Michael Rubin.
Hey, thanks, John.
Back for more abuse. All right, let's start with the memo that you and I just wrote together at FDD. Let's talk about Turkey's Hamas support. What's Erdogan's motivation here? Why is he doing this? And is it going to pay off for him?
Well, ultimately, we need to understand that the man is ideological. When he feigned moderation in the past, maybe that was a tactic. But as he ages, as he consolidates control, we see the real Erdogan coming out. And I think there's a psychological component here too, John, much like we see with Ali Khamenei, that he realizes he's in the twilight of his life. And perhaps after having dedicated his life to anti-Semitic causes, to eradicating Israel, he actually wants to see it come to fruition. And so all stops are off, and he's just going full speed ahead for his agenda.
And he certainly is. A lot of nasty rhetoric over the weekend calling for the obliteration of Israel. Well, let's talk about these protests now that Erdogan is dealing with. How seriously do you take these? I mean, is there actually a chance that Erdogan goes down as a result of these protests?
Look, these protests are hugely serious, but this isn't a democracy. And so ultimately the question becomes, even if you have 2.2 million people in the streets of Istanbul, are they willing to march to the palaces and prisons? And conversely, are Erdogan's personal guards willing to fire on the crowds in the street to prevent this from happening? That's ultimately going to be the determining factor, not simply the fact that out of a country of 90 million, you have more than 1%. You have almost 2% or more. I'm not in the think tank world for math, pushing for a sense of no more. I mean, remember, Imamoglu isn't the first politician to be arrested. I mean, you had Selahattin Demirtas, you've had others along the way. And so, whereas just a couple years ago, we were talking about how Erdogan wasn't going to, not we, you and I, but some people who were a little bit more gullible in Washington, were talking about how Erdogan was going to step down in 2028, how Imamoglu's rise confirmed that Turkey really is a democracy. The fact of the matter is, we're at an inflection point, and what I would say to the Turks is that every protester on the street now, and every protester willing to continue to come out in the next weeks, is as consequential to the future of Turkey as Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was to creating modern Turkey itself.
Yeah, absolutely an inflection point. And I think it's interesting. I mean, we're seeing Imamoglu's wife coming out. She's taken on a very public role. But I think we're going to need to see more figures become prominent, more figures step up, not just taking to the streets, but I think we need to see popular figures harnessing this protest. That's what the Turks can do. I think my question for you right now is, what can America do to help here? I mean, I'm not sure that President Trump is going to go all in with these protesters. He's had a kind of a bromance with Erdogan in years past, hasn't he? I mean, these guys are fist bumping in the hallways of Turtle Bay at the UN. He seems to have a decent relationship with him. Do you think he's going to tip the balance? Is this something that Congress should get involved in? Or are there other actors here in the U.S. that can help maybe even bring down the regime of Erdogan?
You know, John, that's the question. And the fact of the matter is, I've been disappointed with just how quiet, not just the U.S. response, but the international response to this has been. As you mentioned, these protests have now been going on for well over a week. They're not going away. Now, the strategy I would take with Donald Trump is, on one hand, look, Erdogan is the president whisperer. And even as the murder rate of women inside Turkey increased 1,400%, according to Turkey's own interior ministry, President Obama said that Erdogan was someone who one of his top trusted friends, whom he talks about raising teenage daughters with. And when it comes to Trump, this is the strategy I would take with Trump. Trump initially approached Erdogan as a strongman, and you talked about the bromance. But Trump doesn't like to ally himself with losers. He likes to ally himself with people he thinks are winners. And so what we need to do is make clear to Trump, and this could be the role of Congress, saying, hey, no, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a loser. You don't want to tie yourself to a loser, and it's time to jump ship. There's plenty of Turks out there who you can embrace, because let's also face it, as much as some of the countries around bash Turkey, in reality, they're bashing Erdogan's Turkey. Because when I talk to Cypriots, when I talk to Armenians, when I talk to Kurds, Greeks, and so forth, everyone agrees that the region isn't going to thrive until there's a Turkey at peace with itself and its neighbors. And so it's in everyone's interest, including that of the United States, to ensure that Turkey is at peace with itself. Now, moving forward, absolutely there's a role for Congress. And certainly, U.S. foreign policy more writ large, we are at our strongest in terms of foreign policy when we actually calibrate our policy towards reality, rather than to the wishful thinking of what we want Turkey to be or what Turkey was 20 years ago. That's why I found working on the FDD policy memo so illuminating, because when I looked at your work, when I looked at Sinan's work, when I looked at Melissa's work, you really laid out, I mean, it wasn't filled with adjectives or amorphous talk. It was filled with cold, hard facts. And anyone that looks at those cold, hard facts about how Turkey, since 2006, has been pivoting to Hamas, would find it crazy that we would trust this group. One issue I've worked on a little bit more is with regard to Turkey's military industries and their reverse engineering of technology. So in a situation like that, why would we give them upgraded F-16s, let alone F-35s, when they openly talk about how they want to create their own next generation stealth fighter to export to, groups like Hamas, perhaps? This is why I think we need to be on top of this. And if President Trump won't, look, we still have separation of powers. And last point here, John, back in 2010, when Namik Tan was ambassador to Washington, he talked about how the Turkey Congressional Caucus was really a metric of Turkey's influence in Washington. It had more than 200 members. Last time I counted, the Congressional Algae Caucus, dealing with the problems of algae in the Gulf of Gulf of America, was larger than the Congressional Turkey Caucus. Congress has a bipartisan interest in making America great, even if they differ in how they define that greatness. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to COSTA sanctions and so forth, Congress needs to stand up, and I think Trump will follow.
I need to ask you something, and I didn't plan on asking you this. We talked about the questions before you came on, but you mentioned that sort of amorphous thinking, the adjectives or the people that look back and not at the present. They look at what Turkey was supposed to be. What do these people actually think right now? I mean, you look at a guy, he's supporting terrorism across the region, Hamas, Al Qaeda in Syria, ISIS, right? He's got 2 million people out in the streets protesting his authoritarian rule. What do these people actually think we're going to get from this man?
Okay, this I can answer. First of all, just as an aside, you mentioned Syria. One issue I think we need to pay much more attention to is Ahmed al-Shada's appointment of al-Rifai as Syria's Grand Mufti. You can dig down into that, but that man is in deep and bad. Now, going to the heart of your question, what Trump believes is that Erdogan can be the intermediary to make deals on Ukraine and Russia, perhaps on Iran. But we now see that Russia and Iran aren't interested in this. And we also have to understand the whole Yasser Arafat tactic that sometimes people are more interested in the process than the peace. If there's one thing we learned from also negotiations with the Taliban, negotiations with regard to the hostages in Gaza using Qatari intermediaries, you never want to use an intermediary that wants you to lose. Now, more broadly speaking, within the State Department and so forth, and some within the think tank community, there's this belief that, the problem is Erdogan. People are finally admitting it. But when Erdogan goes, we can go back to the status quo ante. But if you do a back of the napkin calculation, 35 million Turkish school children have gone through the education system under Erdogan. He's completely reworked the Turkish military. The Turkish bureaucracy has been transformed into his image. So even if Erdogan disappears tomorrow, you're still going to have to deal with a generation of Erdoganism that needs to be extricated from Turkey. When Erdogan goes, it's the end of the beginning. It's not the beginning of the end.
That's depressing. Let me ask you this. We talked about the role of the U.S. Are there actors in the Middle East that can help nudge things in the right direction as we watch Turks take to the streets right now protesting Erdogan? I noticed today there was a full-blown spat on X, on Twitter, between the Turkish foreign ministry and the Israeli foreign ministry. I'm not sure the Israelis can help tip the balance here, but there are a whole bunch of other countries in the region that really don't like Erdogan, really don't like the regime that he's built in Turkey. So are there other players here that we might look to?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, another shout out to FDD. There's no think tank in Washington that covers financial issues as well as you guys do. And you've been publishing a lot, for example, on the Iranian exchange rate and the decline of the Iranian rial. But it's also fascinating to look at the Turkish lira. The Turkish lira shot up when these protests happened, when Imamoglu was arrested. So it's now around 38 to the dollar. But Erdogan has been pumping through the hard currency reserves to try to keep the currency stable. And it's costing him tens of billions of dollars, quite literally. So the question is, can you pull the carpet out? Can the Emiratis, can the Qataris, can others pull the carpet out to prevent Turkey from having an endless supply to prop up its currency? Because also, as we saw during the first Trump administration, with regard to Pastor Andrew Brunson, when Trump threatened to impose relatively minor steel tariffs on Turkey, the currency declined broadly and Erdogan backed down. I think it's really past time to pressure some of our Gulf allies and say, hey, look, don't help Erdogan prop up his currency. This needs to end. And even as much as we bash the Qataris and as much as I have difficulty with the Qataris, and we've all seen what's going on in the Israeli press today, which we can talk about if you want. But the fact of the matter is, ultimately, the point isn't simply to bash Qatar. The point is to change Qatar's behavior, to give them an off-ramp, to make them once again a responsible member of society. And in a situation like that, this could be a first good test case to say, hey, look, Erdogan is a loser, let him go, or it's you next.
Yeah, I think the Qataris probably are not the ones who are going to help out here. They see the Turks as partners in propping up the Muslim Brotherhood around the region. They truly are an axis, the Muslim Brotherhood axis. But I could imagine the Emiratis, the Saudis, and maybe some other Gulf nations that really had a hard time with Erdogan during the Arab Spring. This might be their chance, right? This could be
I agree with you. The only, just squaring that circle, all I'm saying is that we can't constantly give up on the Qataris. We have to attach a cost to each and every one of their decisions. And this is a case in point. But I agree, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others are going to be far more influential here.
Fully buy in. All right, you mentioned what we just saw in the press today. It's a little fuzzy still right now, but still pretty damning if true. What did you note in the press today about Qatar?
Well, what Ynet is reporting is that the editor of the Jerusalem Post has been questioned under warning, meaning with the possibility of pending criminal charges for being part and parcel of this Qatar influence scandal, which seems to be growing around both Benjamin Netanyahu, or specifically has entrapped some of his advisors with or without his knowledge. And it seems to be spreading where they've documented that not only was the editor of the Jerusalem Post seemingly paid to promote pro-Qatar content, but that he was also given space on Channel 12, Channel 13, and so forth to promote the same sort of content. And if that's true, what we see is really how Qatar operates. And again, not only in Israel, everywhere in the world. The lesson as an American policymaker is that we should look at what is unfolding in Israel right now with this Qatari influence scandal and question, is the same thing happening here with Qatar? Is it happening with Turkey? Is it happening with Azerbaijan or any other country? So that we understand what the loopholes are that these autocrats and ideologues exploit in order to try to shape public opinion.
Yeah, and of course, we know that the Qataris were involved in the bribery scandal that brought down Senator Menendez not too long ago. So we know that it exists in the United States. I think the question is, how deep does it go? Last question before I let you go, Michael, in I don't know, 30 seconds or less. How are things holding? It's been pretty quiet in Iraq. I know you spent a lot of time there. You're an Iraq specialist. You actually spent time there during the war. Do you see the whole Shia militia thing kind of reaching a soft landing, or is this a false sense of security that some are picking up now out of the region?
Well, first of all, very quickly, you mentioned Senator Menendez, and just for the conspiracy theorists, every time I talk to you online, I then go to Google and say, how much is a bar of gold worth? Just to lay the record there. But putting that aside, look, I think actually out of Iraq, there's some good news. Sometimes no news is good news. And when we've seen, for example, the direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, when we see the Houthis striking at Israel, what we aren't seeing, because it's not happening, is many of these Iraqi militias, these Iranian-backed Iraqi militias, getting involved directly. And that's because it appears that Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, the prime minister of Iraq, has actually managed to tell them, this isn't our fight, and we're putting you under control. I mean, that suggests that the slow process of trying to help Iraq get control of its territory, not become a second Lebanon with Hezbollah, is actually starting to work. Now, what I worry about moving forward under the Trump administration is that actually takes engagement. I mean, and if you simply throw out the baby with the bathwater, it could have negative effects.
Got it. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Michael Rubin, for letting us end on a positive note. And thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. As I noted, I co-wrote a somewhat scathing FDD memo with Michael and two of my FDD colleagues on Ankara's unrelenting support for Hamas. If you want to get smart on this topic, and it's really not often covered in the American media, you can check it out on FDD's website. It's called Turkey and Hamas, Partners in Terror. My colleague Ruel Mark Garak wrote a piece for Unheard highlighting divisions within the Trump administration over how to handle the Houthis and their Iranian backers. It's all laid bare in that recent Signal chat debacle. Ruel argues that Trump's hope for a nuclear deal with Iran undermines any chance of success against the Houthis. Iran's proxy imperialism is inextricably tied to its nuclear ambitions. Finally, FDD founder and Cliff May's latest column in the Washington Times critiques the failed failed Russia policies of Obama and Biden. Cliff warns of the dangers of the current administration repeating these past mistakes, and he emphasizes the need for Trump to persuade Putin to agree to a ceasefire for the sake of Ukraine's sovereignty and Trump's legacy. All right, that's enough hot air for me today, folks. If you're feeling the need for more smart stuff, check out the expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please do consider supporting our mission with a generous yet tax-deductible donation at ftd.org/invest. We simply cannot do the work we do without the support of you. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. The news is moving fast and furious, so we'll keep close tabs, and we'll see you in 2 days. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.